The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello and welcome to the keynote session of the day. My name is Tyra Banks. I'm part of NCPMI Professional Development Group, and I will be your moderator for this session on how unconscious bias impacts Agile values and principles in teams, presented by Ebony Burrows and Kyle Morton. Before we get started, I have a few housekeeping items to share. First up for this session, all lines are muted. If you have questions for the speaker, please leave them as well as answers to the speaker's post questions in the Q&A box. This is also where we can help with any help desk questions. Secondly, this session will be recorded and will be available on demand afterwards in this platform until September 5th. Next, if you are attending the session live and you provided the correct information during registration, the PDUs you can earn for the session will be submitted on your behalf by NCPMI. If you're viewing the session on demand, or for some reason you attended live, but the PDUs are not automatically processed, you will need to report the PDUs yourself. Claim codes will be shown toward the end of the presentation. You can also reach out to Vice President of Professional Development, Richard Brown, with any questions. And lastly, this event would not be possible without our sponsors. A big thank you for Insight for sponsoring this event. So now I'd like to introduce to you this presentation speakers, Ebony Burrows and Kyle Morton. Ebony Burrows has spent most of her 20-plus year career in the world of information technology in various functions and roles. For the last 7 years, she has dedicated her career to growing as an experienced Agilist, coaching teams and organizations as they implement Agile concepts and practices, and shifting to people-centric workplace cultures. Her experience has been applied in industries such as finance, utilities, insurance, retail, engineering, and communications. Kyle Morton's primary focus has been helping development teams be effective and enjoy their work. He has over 20 years of experience in building Agile teams for software development or other technology delivery. Kyle has been with Insight for the last 6 years, working in Agile coaching and training. Additionally, he has held or practiced roles including business analyst, quality assurance, user experience architect, Agile manager, project manager, and program manager. Ebony and Kyle, thank you for joining us today. We are so glad to have you with us, and I can take it over to Kyle.
Okay, we'll get there. Ebony?
All right. Thank you, Tyra, for that wonderful introduction. Yeah, we can go ahead and get started. So welcome to Unconscious Bias and Agility, and we'll be talking about the impact of unconscious bias on teams, organizations, and how they are able to implement Agile values and principles. Next slide. All right, so going over a few of the learning points for today. First, we'll identify unconscious biases that may be impacting your people in your organization or your teams right now. We'll learn some practices and approaches to address unconscious bias in your environment and limit their impact. We're hoping that you go away with the ability to rethink the way that you and your teams approach work and the way that people work together. And we also want to make sure that we understand just the simple principles and the actionable steps for helping people and teams do their best work. All right, and so just a brief, another brief intro, less about who we are as work people, more about who we are as people. So first of all, you'll notice that on this slide, we're representing ourselves as Bitmojis. Kyle and I work out of the Charlotte office, and we are known for our obsession with Bitmojis and caricatures. So this is me. The sandwich is highly representative. My Bitmoji always has a sandwich or a taco on her t-shirt. Along with being passionate about food, especially food that are wrapped in tacos and bread, I am really passionate about creating inclusive cultures. I am the co-chair of Afro Professionals and Allies at Insight, one of 7 teammate resource groups at Insight. It's my yay job, but it's also an interconnection between what I do as an Agile coach and what I do within the space of diversity and inclusion. In addition, I love comedy. I laugh a lot. I also enjoy horror movies, horror stories, storytelling. I listen to a lot of podcasts. I do also watch a lot of television. And I've read all of the books by Stephen King. So I'm always actively looking for the next one that's going to come out.
Yeah. I'll vouch that Ebony does like laughing and having a good time. So I always enjoy when I get a chance to spend time with her. So we cut up together. I'm also passionate about creating inclusive and effective teams. It's been much of my career has been trying to do those things, but outside hiking, cooking, storytelling, podcasts like Ebony. And I also think that we're currently in a golden age of television. The last 10 years has had some of the best TV out there. So it helped through the pandemic. So that's me. And that is my Bitmoji. But enough about me and a little bit about cannibalism. This is the Donner Party. I don't know if anyone's familiar with the Donner Party or not. It's certainly a story that gets told in California's public school history about a group of immigrants coming from Missouri in 1846. So that's just kind of on the cusp of before California became a U.S. state. And so there was a lot of immigration occurring coming from the East or the Midwest, heading out to the land of promise, the Golden State, California. And this particular group, they left a little late. They had this book called The Immigrant's Guide to Oregon and California, and they were using that as their North Star. Okay, we're going to follow the guide, and it's going to help us get to the California-Oregon area where we can settle and, fulfill our dreams. There was 87 people roughly. The number kind of changed a little bit as they were going. But as they were going, there was 2 big trails that got used a lot. In the south, you have the Santa Fe Trail. In the north, you had the Oregon Trail. Some of you may be familiar with the game, the Oregon Trail. And so there was lots of people that would go those directions. There was guides that you could hire, and it'd be almost like a caravan of people, and people jettisoning stuff they didn't need anymore, just sitting right by the side of the trail. But Lansford's Hastings book talked about another way called the Hastings Path. And so they were following what Hastings had to say. That was kind of their plan, and they were sticking to it. And they started encountering people and also some of the professional guides and saying, hey, us 87 immigrants are going to take us and our families this direction. And they're like, that's not a good idea. That's going to not end up well. You shouldn't do that. Stick to these big trails. There's tons of people on it. It would be nice and straightforward. And they're like, no, we're following the book. So lo and behold, they get stuck in the snow in the Sierra Nevadas. They can't get out. They actually try a couple of times to have a party to get out, and it doesn't work. And pretty soon starvation sets in. People start dying. That's where the cannibalism comes into play. It wasn't pretty, right? There was even allegations of murder followed by cannibalism. Nobody was ever tried for it, but it didn't end up well, and pretty much close to half of them died before they were rescued in February of 1847. So why did they do that? Why did they stick to this plan of following Hastings' path when they were told by multiple groups and peoples that, hey, that's not going to work for you, and it didn't? Why did they stick to it? And I'm gonna kind of leave that hanging and not answer it maybe till a little bit later. But they stuck to it to the end. You're faced with around 11 million pieces of information at a given moment. The brain can only process 40 of those bits of information at any one time. So it creates shortcuts and uses past knowledge to make assumptions. It's the world that we all live in. We hear different ideas, we see different things, we see options, and there's just tons and tons of information that's floating around us every day, every moment. And the brain can't take all of those in. It has to find patterns and find reference points of something in the past so that we can make the decisions to get through our lives, because we don't want to sit down and think about every decision, or we might be paralyzed in action. We do these shortcuts so that we can think faster and make decisions quicker. Well, one of those shortcuts is bias. Our brain is trying to process information and trying to make decisions and trying to do the right thing. So we create these little shortcuts that allow us to reach a decision or make an action without having to think about it. And some of those biases are actually end up being quite negative. And I want to start with that. There's a social psychologist, Claude Steele, who does some interesting work. There's some good podcasts out there about him, and he has a book that we'll reference later. But he did a lot of research on what is the impact of stereotypes in terms of people's effectiveness. So he did these experiments. He did 2 experiments. One experiment, both of them were with college students. One experiment is they got 2 groups of math students, college level math students, about 50-50 between men and women in each of the 2 groups. In the first group, the control group, they said, hey, this is just going to be for fun. You can find out how much you know about math. It's going to be hard, but you're just going to learn a lot. It'll be great. They administered the test to the students, and the male and the female students did about the same. Got the second group, once again, about half men, half women, and they said this test will show whether you have an aptitude for math. If you can't do well in this, you're not going to have a math career. Well, some of you may know there is definitely there is a stereotype about women in math, and a lot of the women in that room were aware of that stereotype. Now, the men didn't have to worry about it because there was no stereotype about them, no negative stereotype about them in math. But the women got faced with that, and as a result, they performed less well than the male students. Remember, these 2 groups are just randomly selected. Claude believed that it was the weight of that stereotype on those female math students that made it harder for them to perform well on the tests. They had they had the stress of not wanting to prove the stereotype. They had to think through, hey, wait a minute, am I really good at math? Some people think I'm not, and had to worry about that while they were trying to do a cognitive process. And so it basically took away some of their bandwidth, multitasking in a sense. Also a little discouragement, like you can't overcome this. Code switching is another way of stating multitasking. And these female math students had to deal with that. Male students didn't. But in the other experiment, they leaned away from the stereotype and they made it just seem like it's fun. There's no stereotype to fight. They did a second study with white and black students, and they told the control group, hey, this is just an experiment to learn more about your, you'll get pushed and you'll learn a lot, but it's no big deal. And the black and the white students performed the same. But then the second group, they said, this will tell you whether you're going to have success in academia. Can you be successful in an academic environment? And they conducted those same tests, and the white students performed better than the black students. Why am I telling you this? This study here is a tangible example of measuring the impact that stereotypes and biases can have on groups, have on people, our teams, our projects, our work environment. We can have a negative impact on some of our teammates' abilities to perform well when we're exhibiting stereotypes and biases in a way that makes them have to multitask or to stress or to feel that discouragement. So there's a real risk. We're dealing with a real problem that occurs inside of our teams when we have biases that are affecting what we do.
Yeah, Kyle, before we go to the next slide, I'll just like to bring the audience's attention to those 3 causes again. I mean, in the world of Agile, you've probably heard us talk a lot about the cost of context switching, multitasking, trying to do more than one thing at a time, and how ineffective that really is, how important it is to be able to focus. Well, when we start thinking about the impact of unconscious bias and stereotypes, code switching is a type of context switching. If you're spending time trying to use the acceptable words for your audience, if you're spending time trying to have the right tone or to communicate in a way that's acceptable to your teammates, or in your work environment, how much of that time are you not spending on actually just doing good work? And so I think this is where authenticity is also really important, being in an environment where you can be yourself, and you can be trusted to be a professional without having to context/code switch in order to be accepted as a good communicator in your workplace.
Yeah. And in case some people are unfamiliar with the term code switching, could you define that a little bit better?
Yeah, so code switch is a term that we use a lot in the African American community. But I think all of us can probably appreciate it. We usually talk a certain way to our friends, like outside of work, the people we spend the most time with when we're having fun. There's a certain way that we communicate to our friends and our family, but we don't necessarily bring that same energy into the workplace. There's certain words that we use with our friends and our family that we limit using within the workplace. Code switching is when you are less authentic. Those authentic ways of expression, you make a conscious decision to tamper or dampen that down within your workplace environment. And granted, you definitely want to be professional. You definitely want to engage with people in a way where everyone feels included. You want to limit using terms that people are constantly, what does that mean? Or what do you mean when you say that? But at the same time, you want to try to avoid presenting yourself in a way that is not true to who you are at your core. So hopefully
Yeah.
that explains code switching.
Yeah, thank you, Ebony. I appreciate it. And another little factor here that comes to play is how damaging is the stereotype or the bias? I mean, I'm a 57-year-old white male. The biases against me are not very damaging, but some of the biases against people who maybe aren't 57-year-old white males can be a lot more damaging. So yeah, there's probably biases that get tilted toward me, but they're not very threatening, so I don't have to worry about them. I can be more of my authentic self and use my normal vocabulary versus somebody else who maybe can't. And so that's a cognitive load on them for that code switching. Okay. Thank you, Ebony.
All right. In this next slide, I'm just going to give you a little bit of a description between what we mean by conscious bias versus unconscious bias. Conscious bias is described in this list of detail here. So it's usually expressed directly. It's explicit. The person who is exhibiting bias is usually aware that they are. And from their perspective, they probably have their own reasons why this bias makes sense to them, which means it's intentional. It is sometimes expressed with malice, but not always. Even if someone is aware that they have a bias, they may not be fully aware that the bias is malicious, or they may not be conscious that there's malicious intent tied to that bias. And then, of course, lastly, this is usually bias that's easily observed. So when we witness it, we know exactly what it is. We can have a conversation about it. We can address it. Next would be unconscious bias. So this is pretty much the opposite of what we mean with conscious bias. It's expressed indirectly, or it's implicit. It's the person who is expressing the bias is usually unaware of it. They are not they don't have an intentional meaning behind the bias. It's something that they're just really not conscious of. They're not aware. It's not something they're doing on purpose. There's a gaslighting effect to unconscious bias as well, and I'm going to come back to that in just a second. But also, unconscious bias is not easily observed. It's usually something we feel in our gut. When it's happening, you kind of feel like that doesn't seem right, but maybe you can't put your finger on it to say exactly what's going on. You just know that something about this conversation or this interaction is off. Going back to what we mean by unconscious gaslighting. And so as we were doing the research for this presentation, I realized that this is something that I am personally guilty of. Unconscious gaslighting is when the person is totally unaware that they are engaging in gaslighting. All right. So we've probably heard the term gaslighting, but we don't realize that there is also unconscious gaslighting. So, in fact, that person may perceive that they are being very reasonable in their interactions because they have no clue about the impact of what they're doing. They might even lack the capacity or willingness to question their own viewpoint in considerations of another person's viewpoint. So, for example, if Kyle is trying to explain something to me and I'm not connecting on the information. If I go, I don't get it, but I don't follow up with the question, or I don't ask him for follow-up information to help connect the dots for me. If I'm just dismissive, I'm not, it's not seeping in and I'm dismissive, the more I shrug shoulders, the more I have a dismissive attitude about what Kyle is telling me, Kyle's response could be to question whether or not he's explaining it well. Is this even something valid that we should be talking
or that I
about?
know what I'm talking about.
Right, right. Do I even know what I'm talking about? And so I didn't realize that this is something I did until I saw that there was a term called unconscious gaslighting. And I've learned that I'm really good for just quickly going, I don't get it. You know, and that's the end of the conversation. But now I think it's okay. What I've learned about myself is to say, get me to where you are. I'm not totally understanding how this relates to the conversation that we're having, or what action we're supposed to take by what information you're sharing. I think this is what I'm missing. The response here is to just stay engaged and help the other person continue to be in the conversation with you versus being dismissive and making them feel like, or presenting yourself in a way that makes them feel like they're somewhat in the wrong for even bringing up this conversation.
Yeah, kind of the origin of gaslighting is intentionally trying to create the conditions in which somebody begins to question their reality.
Mm-hmm.
And then it's being used even a broader, like questioning their own intelligence or their own decision making, but doing so in a way that they're like, well, I guess I don't know what I'm talking about, or I guess I can't trust my instinct, or I can't, or maybe I'm not seeing things clearly.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
We don't do that for our teammates. On the observable point, interesting studies that show that, one, we think we're really good at understanding the intentions and the biases, both conscious and unconscious, of others, but we're not really, but we feel like we are. And then in addition to that, we're really bad at understanding our own unconscious bias. We make those decisions thinking, hey, I thought that through, without realizing what was the shortcut we took to get to that decision. So we're really bad at identifying those biases in ourselves. So.
And the thing too, to close out this slide, is it's really important to realize that we all harbor biases. We've all been on the receiving end of a bias, but we've all expressed bias, whether consciously or unconsciously. Excuse me. So it's important to know that this is something we all have to deal with, that we're all kind of responsible for mitigating that impact. So, one question I would leave before we move on to the next slide is, when teams collaborate, does unconscious bias contribute to their dysfunctions? If you think about the teams that you've been on and decisions that have been made, or difficulty for people working together, large teams or small teams, have you ever wondered whether or not there is a bias at play in the way you and your teams are interacting with each other?
Yeah. Okay, you ready to move on?
Yep. All right. So, of course, Kyle and I are Agile coaches. So this presentation, of course, would have to include something very specific to Agile. So we wanted to remind you about these 4 values of Agile: individuals and interactions over processes and tools, working software over comprehensive documentation, customer collaboration over contract negotiation, and responding to change over following a plan. So many of you have probably seen these values before, or that you probably read the Agile Manifesto before. Just a reminder that this is everything that we're talking to about today directly relates to these values and principles that I'm showing you. And again, the items in pink, the values in pink, we value those over the values in black. But it doesn't mean that, for example, processes and tools don't matter at all, or that documentation doesn't matter in the world of Agile. Of course, negotiation matters. Of course, a plan matters. There's this myth in Agile that we don't plan, we just do, when really we plan all of the time, we plan constantly. So with these values in place, it's just a reminder that outcomes and interactions and people and how people interact with each other and just being responsive, those are the things that we really build our intentions around, build our teams around. And that's the culture of agility. If we're not focusing on people, things that work, how we work together, and how responsive we can be, then all of those other things really don't matter that much. So you click and go to the principles.
I could see a strong connection between the negative effects of unconscious bias, really not valuing individuals and interactions or responding to change. They could have a big impact on it.
Right, absolutely. There are also 12 principles of Agile, which I won't go through all at once, just reminding you that these principles do exist. The first one, customer satisfaction. Always focus on satisfying the customer as often as we can with great quality. It's not it's not an accident that that's our first principle. Satisfy the customer. But I think if you look closely at these principles, you see that they're directly related to these four values on the left side. If we think about unconscious bias and specifically now these 12 principles, what are some of the ways, and it's just, something for you to sit with, how are some of the ways that unconscious bias could, one, impact your ability to satisfy your customer? How could what impact could unconscious bias play into keeping things simple, which is Agile principle number 10, maximizing the amount of work not done? How does unconscious bias have an impact on the way you communicate? So we have an Agile principle that says to have face-to-face conversations as much as possible, or it's the prime communication method. Well, most of us are working from home virtually. Have you noticed that maybe there's a bias in the way that we communicate now that virtual working is so common now? And then, of course, my favorite here is to build projects around motivated people, motivated teams, right? Is there a bias at play when you're putting your teams together to do work? Not you individually, but maybe there's a bias in your organization or just in the culture. So all of these things are really important to consider when you are working in an environment that's trying to enact this agile culture, that's trying to kind of build in these concepts. It's important to pay attention to inspect yourself, to inspect the culture of your organization, just to see if there are biases that keep you from living these values and principles as much as you possibly can.
Yeah, I like that, Evan.
All right. Now we want to show you some biases that you're probably very familiar with. So, of course, there's beauty, age, culture, gender, racial or ethnicity, name bias. These are some obvious biases. I think they probably show up as more conscious biases. We can usually see what's happening when someone is expressing this bias, but they can also be unconscious biases as well. Like someone could have a bias against someone because of their age and not really fully be aware that that's why they're making a decision or why they have an opinion about that person. But again, kind of going back to why we're even having this conversation, biases make an impact on the way that we make decisions about the things that we do every day, about how we decide to work with people, about our personal relationships. So again, decisions are highly impactful by the biases that we have that we aren't aware of. So we've got these biases that sit on top of the iceberg, and we purposely chose to represent these biases as an iceberg because the most dangerous part of the iceberg is what we don't see under the water. And what we now see here are biases that you may or may not be that familiar with. So, now granted, when we were doing the research for this presentation, we had a long list of different types of biases.
Yeah, this is just a fraction.
Yeah, a very, very small fraction of all of the different biases we could have pulled out. But, affinity bias, feeling a connection to someone who's like us. Have you ever made a decision about anything simply because you felt a personal connection to someone? Confirmation bias, looking to confirm your own opinion and pre-existing ideas. The halo effect or halo bias, projecting a positive quality onto someone without really knowing them. Then you've got recency bias, attributing greater importance to something because of a recent event that's happened. Authority, you attribute greater importance to someone who's in a position of authority. And then lastly, we have this anchor bias, that reliance on the first piece of information or attributing greater importance because it's the first information you got or the first thing you were told to be true. So all of these were somewhat new, I think, to Kyle and I. And as we thought about it, we started playing back like different teams that we've worked with, different work experiences that we've had. And it was just amazing that I think all six of these below the surface biases, I think we could tell a story about all of them. And it's really scary not realize that the way we think about things and biases, it's very scary to realize that this is happening in our minds and we don't even know it. We're just zero awareness of it. So this is why we thought it was important to just remind you that whether you know this bias exists, it's impacting the decisions you make, even if you're not fully aware of it.
Yeah, impacting decisions and also impacting the attitudes of both yourself and the people around you.
Mm-hmm.
Back to cannibalism. So our good friends, the Donner Party. Looking at some of these biases and going back to the Donner Party, my opinion is they fell prey to a couple of them. One was the anchor bias. They had decided way back, I think it was in Indiana when they got started, to say, we've read this book, we're going to follow this book. And so that was their anchor. And any new information, they use confirmation bias to say, oh, no, we already know where we're going. You guys don't know what you're talking about. They minimize the information that said, don't go that trail. And they maximize, what they were reading in the book. You also have a authority bias. They have a published book in their hand that they can kind of wave in the air and say, no, the book says to go this way. And so when people disagree with them, they say, no, this guy's an authority. He's a published author. And there's affinity bias going too. They were immigrants. The book is The Immigrant's Guide. So you can see them going, oh, these other people, they're not immigrants. We're immigrants. We have this affinity. So, I know that I'm speculating on this, but to me, it seems pretty clear that these biases are at work with them, making a bad decision repeatedly, and ended up with negative consequences, even though, hey, they were just trying to make it to Oregon, California. They didn't have any ill intent, but these biases really led them the wrong way. So cost most of them their lives. Well, half of them. Okay, we're going to do an exercise. So for this exercise, we're going to start out with a little quiet time. We'll probably do it for 3 minutes. Maybe we'll do 2 minutes. But I want you to take a minute and I want you to think about some work situations or even personal situations if you want to do that, and think about how unconscious biases, how they can or have negatively impacted your Agile teams or your interactions or maybe even your relationships. So I'm going to go ahead and actually have quiet time. Nobody's going to talk for 2 minutes, unless Ebony wants to. You can, but jot some of those down, and then after 2 minutes, we'll come back.
I am also going to participate in quiet time.
Okay, it's been 2 minutes. Thank you for taking that quiet time. Just as a small note, a little bonus takeaway here. The reason why I have just that 2 minutes worth of quiet time, which isn't much, feels like a long time for some folks, including me. But it's me recognizing biases that exist or ways of thinking between extroverted thinking and introverted thinking. Extroverts love the conversation and get it going and throw out ideas, and the introverts are saying, can we slow down? I don't have time to think. So I usually try to create a little space for the introverts to at least get a head start on something like this before the extroverts jump in and start talking. I was also pointing out to Ebony, whenever I do this exercise, you can tell who the extroverts are, because after like 2 or 3 minutes, they're dying to say something. So like, I hate this quiet thing, cut it out. But you know, if it benefits some of our teammates to just carve out a little bit of time, that's a good thing.
Yeah, I'm usually the extrovert person. I don't like quiet time, but I'm working on it. I'm getting better.
Yeah, interesting. So just to kind of answer the question for Ebony, and I didn't answer this question personally. I was self-reflecting and thought back to an instance in which I had, but I was probably leaning into a stereotype, but definitely was a bias based on race, ethnicity, and gender. I was in a position to be able to put people in a little bit more leadership type of role. You know, had a group of people to choose from, and there was one that I you know, that person just is really opinionated and is not very like friendly to people. I don't think that they would be good in that situation. Now, this person happened to be a Black American female, and I said, you know, she's not really the right temperament for that role. And a little bit later down the road, there was another Black American female who was much friendlier and personable. And I thought, oh, okay, she'd be great in that role. And then I had a reason to reconsider, like, wait, what were the unconscious things and maybe even some conscious things going on in my head that were leading me to that decision? Because truthfully, this other person who, wasn't warm and fuzzy, but she was very reasonable and very smart and very, capable. I think I was leaning into a stereotype about, angry Black females, like that's somehow bad and we should avoid that. And I'm like, oh, yeah, yes, I got to change my attitudes on that. I got to check myself and rethink that. So that was a time where I saw unconscious bias having a negative impact on the people around me. So I learned from that. I continue to learn, but I learned from that in the past.
Yeah,
Ebony, you want to share one?
yeah. I just, specifically for that example you gave, I think, when we go back to the example, the Claude Steele conversation from earlier, I think, and we're talking about code switching and multitasking and context switching. I think that's one of those situations where, as a Black woman, I've definitely been in a situation where I thought, you know, how assertive can I be in a conversation? Like, how can I come across as someone who's highly capable and assertive, but without crossing that line to being thought of as an angry Black woman? And I can say, in my case, over the course of 25 years of being a working professional, I know that I've probably missed out on opportunities because I was trying so hard to walk this line. But I think it's really good to be able to look back and go, what really was influencing the way that I thought about this person? What, like, did this person really say something that was kind of, inappropriate, or were they really making me feel like they weren't very kind or very nice? Or was I just responding to something that I wasn't aware of that kind of lived within me? um, I know for me, I've already said that I'm guilty of some unconscious gaslighting. But I'm definitely also someone that has exhibited recency bias. I have a tendency, as a leader of a team of people, especially within the diversity and inclusion space, we're always doing a lot of different things. There's a lot of activity that's going on. And when you lead a TRG, you really lean on the group of people who are working with you to help put together a lot of these events. And there's been certain times where certain people who have taken responsibilities of activities, like maybe they weren't responsive as I thought they should be, or maybe some things fell through the cracks. And one of the things that I've done is I've drawn a conclusion about that person based on something recent that has happened. And I think in that situation or in that scenario, I reminded myself that it's important to give each other grace. We're not always 100% every day. We all have days where we just kind of drop the ball a little bit, but that doesn't mean that we can't be counted on in the long run. So I have had to kind of reflect and go, if this person wasn't, if they weren't their 100% best self on this previous day, I have to be able to kind of work with them and inspect what needs to happen so that we can kind of fill those gaps in the future. What type of support do you need in order to be a good contributor to this team? Was there something specific going on? So just to be a little bit more investigative, and to just not assume that this is who this person is every time going forward. So something that I've had to work on.
Thank you, Evan. Appreciate that. Okay, now we're going to do some audience participation. So in your on your phone, or maybe in another tab in your browser. Oops. Okay, now it's messing with me. Oh, I see. Okay, never mind. Operator error. Go to menti.com, and you'll end up with a screen that asks you for a code. So menti.com. You can do it in your phone or do it in a different tab in your browser, and put in the code 3884-8541. And one thing that you wrote down, or maybe something that you thought of, go ahead and pop in there. So as a group, we can start seeing some of the biases that the other 42 people have run across. So we're going to take a couple minutes and let you guys pop those in there. They'll start to display after a while. I'm going to go ahead and move this to the next slide. But it was menti.com, code 3884-8541. 3884-8541. And let's show those again. So go ahead and pop those in there. And that way I'll be able to show the whole group biases that the audience members identified. Okay, it's been 4 minutes. Feel free to keep popping those in there, even if I'm, in a sense, kind of moving on. But just taking a quick look through these, language, I think that's a big one. That can be both native English speakers and non-native, but also sort of sub-dialects, we'll even call it, inside of the United States can have a negative impact. Ebony and I are from the South, and what do you think when you hear a Southern accent? What's the impact on that now? Neither of us have that accent, but there can be a bias there.
I've definitely experienced working with a team of people who are from New York. And when they heard me on the call, it was like, wow, they weren't really sure what to expect from the lady on the phone who sounded so country to them. But yeah, I definitely. So I think I was impressive, even though I had a deep Southern accent.
I was gonna say, yeah, I know Ebony, and country girl doesn't really come to mind. No, city girl. Anchor bias. There was an example of a bias. I found this interesting. Attending a pre-bid, pre-construction meeting for a civil construction project as an African-American contractor in a Caucasian-dominated field and not being spoken to or addressed.
Mm.
Wow, that's sad. There's not even a chance to come to the table. Geographical. Yeah, there's probably a lot that could go into the geography. Even not just inside the U.S., but also, when you have teammates maybe in India or Eastern Europe, we make assignments. Oh, well, we'll give the QA stuff to India and we'll do the real work here. Well, maybe that's not the best decision.
Mm-hmm.
Assumptions about female managers. Yeah, I think there is a lot of that. You're a leader. Do you feel like you bump up to a lot of assumptions about you, Ebony?
Um, no.
Right. I mean,
I'm a pretty strong personality. I think
mhm.
I will say that I've experienced people wondering whether or not, is this an emotional response? But I think sometimes as a woman leader, it's okay, if you do feel like you're responding to a situation from a place of empathy. I think it's important to call that out. Empathetic leadership is a real thing, and it's something we talk about in Management 3.0 and a lot of our learning, our workshops that we do. Um, so I think, one of those assumptions is that female leaders can be overly emotional when really I think women in leadership bring a certain amount of empathy and awareness that maybe hasn't always been accepted or praised in with male dominated leadership areas.
I don't think we mentioned Management 3.0 on our resource slide, do we? But for those of you who aren't familiar, that's a course of study that you can get certified in, and it's looking at sort of modern concepts around leadership and what's really effective versus some of the patterns that we see in our organizations that are not always effective. Women are treated differently in a negative way because they are female. Yeah, that goes really hand in glove with the assumptions about females.
Mhm.
It's easy to lose your way. Gaslighting bias, where I just dismiss not understanding when everyone else appears to know what is being talked about. Yeah. Yeah, it's hard sometimes to ask questions because then you feel like, am I the only one that doesn't know what they're talking about?
Yeah.
There's a barrier there. And once again, as a 57-year-old male, like it's easier for me to go, wait, what was that? And but if I do it as a 67-year-old male, they might start getting some age bias, and they're like, he's not thinking clearly anymore. Female versus male, pretty versus unattractive, late versus on time, fat versus skinny, put together versus messy. Without a doubt, those are all good. Interesting study that shows people who are good looking are perceived to be more accurate in what they say than people who aren't. Because they can say the exact same thing, and then the studies show that we have a tendency to believe the people who are more attractive than others.
Mm-hmm.
Why? Not because they're more likely to be right, that's for sure. But we perceive it that way. It's one of our biases.
I think that attractive or beauty bias is one of those ones that can really bleed in or invite other biases as well. I mean, being a person of color, you are if beauty bias kind of comes into play, you're already being put up against a certain beauty standard, right? So I'm a Black woman. There's a beauty standard that I might be getting compared to, right? White women, we don't have the same beauty standards. So not only am I being considered, not only might I be considered as whether or not I'm beautiful from an unconscious place, but now racial or ethnic bias starts to play into that because it's not even a fair comparison, because maybe you're thinking about my beauty standard based on a standard that I could never meet.
Yeah. I think I'm going to need to zip through the last of these without spending too much time on them because we want to allow at least a little bit of time for questions. Authority bias, that does definitely come into play. I agree. Halo, new team members from a different department given senior positions on the team due to prior position. So yeah, that they'll come in and be the hero. Quiet people are not contributing. There definitely can be a bias against the more introverted folks. First time I heard a fellow engineer talk and he had a thick country accent like Jethro from the Beverly Hillbillies. He knew what he was talking about. It was eye-popping to me. This was close to 40 years ago. Sort of that bias that people that kind of talk like they were raised in the country are just not going to be as smart, which is, you know, it's not rational. Organizational roles can impact it. The sense of belonging to the group, yeah, that can have a big impact if you don't feel like you're part. New team members can't get up to speed fast enough. Yeah. Educational bias, that's a good one. Recognize the good old boys, white males. If you work in technology, this is big. Mm-hmm. Not allowing strategic involvement because others own the strategy. Yeah, there's an architect that does that. Gaslighting, where a person dismisses ideas because the ideas are not hers or theirs. Yeah, his or hers, excuse me. Definitely. Being biased of language or poor English. Yeah, looking at somebody's grammar, the enunciation, and assuming things about them. Letting something that someone has told me about another person they may have issues with on a project influence my opinion of that person when they become team members on my project. Areas of the state you come from, considering a Yankee coming from New Jersey. Yeah, you moved to North Carolina, you're okay. But there's a whole bunch of us. Name bias. People think that I am Irish, blue eyes and red hair until they see me in person. Being told that, wow, I thought you were Irish. Interesting. Having experienced cultural bias at my workplace. Majority of developers at my workplace are from India. Some face challenges with verbal communication. As a project program manager, I come across the team members that are short, judgmental with them. Yeah, it's easy to fall into that. I experienced anchor bias when communicating with my husband several times. Personal. I reached conclusion based on my perception of his personality instead of really listening to what he is saying and understanding it. Thank you for sharing that. I know that's personal, but yeah, that has a tangible impact, and the same thing happens on our teams. Angry or violent black males. Yeah, I had a white manager raise his voice at me, and I went to approach him to let him know that he could not speak to me in that manner. And how do you do that without appearing to be angry? You know, angry black male. That's a tough balancing act to pull off, I'd imagine. I don't know. I've never had to do it. Okay, so we're marching towards the end here. We need to be done in 3 minutes, and I need to let Tyra have some time. So unfortunately, we're gonna have to skip through questions. Let's get to the challenge. Oh shoot, we missed this whole section. Dang it. So how do you deal with unconscious bias? You seek knowledge. You find out that there is an unconscious bias. And this discussion you've had here is a first step on that, or maybe a further step for you. Practice self-awareness, which is thinking about decisions and thinking about your biases. Facilitate discussions. We had some facilitation of discussions here today where you were sharing your biases. That's important to have that as a practice for your teams. And then participate in training like this, but like others. There's a lot of really good resources out there. We were going to do questions and answers, but we're out of time. This is our resource page. And let me give you, see, there's the book, Whistling Vivaldi, The Scout Mindset, some other resources. Let me lead you with a challenge. So here's what a challenge I want you to do. I want you to carve out some time each of the next 3 weeks, 15 minutes, half an hour, and sit and think, okay, what decisions have we made in this last week that bias could have played a part, my bias could have played a part in. Identify what those are and start thinking about, well, was that a fair bias? Was that unfair? Thank you very much. Tyra. Can't hear you.
Okay. Can you hear me now? Thank you both for that interesting presentation. It's so important for us to look inside ourselves to really affect change in how we deal with others and in our personal and professional lives. So thank you so much. I'm going to share my screen here just so we can move over to some housekeeping items and show the coupon code here. Can you all see the code? Okay. So thanks again, everyone. Next up, we invite you to join us in the networking lounge to share your thoughts in the session. Let us know your biggest takeaway further discussion by starting a topic-specific discussion board or a one-on-one conversation with a peer. The afternoon keynote will begin at 12:15 p.m. Join Dr. Howell Kurtzner as he presents a peek into the future of project management. Thanks for attending the session, and we will see you soon. And over here, we do have the code for this session. Thanks again, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone. I'll be ending the session.
Okay. Thank you.